Welcome to the fall 2024 guest lecture series with the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. My name is Charlie Forbes. I'm the program coordinator for ESR and I'm also an alum of the program. So welcome, wherever you are in the country, in the world. If you're on the West Coast, if you're a student at CIIS or beyond, if you're on the East Coast and you're staying up late, thank you for being here. The purpose of our guest lecture series is to connect with scholars from around the globe who are engaged in critical work across the disciplines of ecology, spirituality, and religion. And through these conversations, we aim to foster a dialogue, expand the field, and create connections that deepen our understanding of these disciplines. This series offers a platform for scholars to share their research and insights, helping to grow our academic community and perhaps inspire future scholarship. So I'm really pleased to welcome Brother Gary Paul Nabhan here today, who I've been excited to speak to hear from for many years now. He's the real definition of a transdisciplinary scholar. He's a prolific writer, a scholar, and an activist. So Gary, thank you for being here with us today. I'm gonna read your bio and give a little bit of an introduction, but just want to let folks know the structure for tonight's event. Dr. Nabhan's going to speak for about 45 minutes with a structured presentation, and there will be time at the end for a Q&A and a bit more of an interactive conversation. I've disabled the chat for now, just while Dr. Nabhan is speaking, so he's not getting a bunch of messages in the chat. The Q&A function is enabled, so while he's speaking, feel free to drop some of your questions in the chat. I'll do my best to address them in the order that they come in. If we move through the Q&A, I'll certainly open it up. And if you all want to unmute and talk to Dr. Nabhan, we can do that. So Brother Gary Paul Nabhan is an agricultural ecologist, ethnobotanist, Ecumenical Franciscan Brother, and author whose work has focused primarily on the intersection of biodiversity and cultural diversity of the arid binational Southwest. He serves as Professor Emeritus of the Kellogg Endowed Chair in Southwestern Borderlands, Food and Water Security at the University of Arizona. He has visited monasteries in contemplative desert spiritual traditions in 6 countries and is a graduate of Richard Rohr's 2-year program at the Living School with the Center for Action and Contemplation in New Mexico. He also just released 2 books, those being Against the American Grain, a Borderlands History of Resistance, and Chili, Clove, and Cardamom, a gastronomic journey into the fragrances and flavors of desert cuisines. His book, Agave Spirits, by the way, The Past, Present, and Future of Mezcals, just won a 2024 James Beard Media Award. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Nabhan, and thank you so much for joining us here this evening and to speaking to ESR. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you all for joining us today. And I'll be looking forward to our dialogue or multi-log in a moment. If you see me do a little twist at one point, I've just had back surgery and my wife's going to come in and help me replug the charger for my laptop. Our whole town went out of internet service today, so I'm hitting up at an old school where another internet server is happening, and she's helping me with my cord in a moment. But I just want to say that I was telling Charlie earlier that I'm so delighted that the dialogue between ecology and spirituality, both among scholars and among lay people, is just so vibrant now. I'm in work groups, one at Stanford, another based at Loyola Marymount, that are sometimes led by Buddhists or Catholics or Jewish spiritual leaders, but we're really on the same page in wanting to see more healing between the sciences and religion on a number of fronts, and this is only one of them that we'll get to tonight. And I would say that I grew up in a relatively religious family. Some of my aunts and cousins were nuns in the Maronite and Antiochian Orthodox faiths of the Lebanese Syrian community in the Middle East. And the engagement with spiritual traditions was still very strong in my immigrant family. At the same time, I had a voracious appetite for all things spiritual. So I've lived in two Buddhist monasteries when I was younger, have practiced walking meditation and Zazen and Christian contemplative practices for years. And I don't see that as sort of the spiritual shopping mall syndrome. I see that a lot of those things fit together with me in a cohesive whole rather than being divergent trials of different practices. By my age, they better be integrated if they're still around, because they don't have too many years to go. The other thing I should say is that although I began my studies in ecology and spirituality about the same time with some very, very good mentors, I very quickly realized that I needed to master some tangible practices of being a field scientist. I worked at the first Earth Day and really wanted to make a difference in how we care for creation. So I dove into that and sort of hid my spirituality from many of my friends and certainly from professional colleagues for a while, until I realized that I had so many disabilities and tragedies happen to me that I better fully express my spiritual yearnings and my need for spiritual dialogue with others, because I couldn't survive without them. So I took time out off a traumatic brain injury or series of injuries, blackouts that impaired my speech and vision, to spend more time with spiritual practice, and have pretty much kept that up ever since some serious traumatic injuries to cognition, vision, and speech about 8 years ago. That said, I'd like to start out by aiming at why someone like me finds such a coherent message in the desert spiritual traditions that have occurred not only in the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions for centuries, but I've also been in places in China where Christian monastics, Zoroastrian monastics, Buddhist and Taoist monastics all had monasteries in the same canyons and were in regular dialogue with one another. And in southern Spain and Morocco, I've been to sacred places where Kabbalistic Jews, Sufi Muslims, and the heirs to Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross were all in dialogue during the Convivencia period in Moorish Spain. So I'm really someone that sort of errs on feeling that we have more to gain by interfaith dialogue than we have to lose. And I hope you'll see that throughout my talk. But, and I should say my talk is injured or impaired at this moment by the fact that I had 2 tubes stuck down my throat all last week while I was in the hospital for back surgery. So if I sound like I'm squawking at any point, hold your hands up and I'll just try harder to enunciate. I do sound like a duck or a goose sometimes, even when I haven't had tubes stuck down my throat. But first of all, let me just be clear that I'm not interested in desert spiritual traditions simply because I live and study deserts. I live in the Sonoran Desert on the US-Mexico border and have lived here for most of the last 50 years. And my relatives are from the deserts on the Arabian Peninsula. But it's really my sense that desert spirituality can be practiced anywhere, not merely in desert landscapes. And they're about gaining something in our spiritual practice from an uncluttered, silent, unfettered existence where we embrace poverty and austerity and elegant simplicity rather than having our days so filled up and bombarded by the media and other demands on our time that we don't have time to meet the silence that is, I think, one of the greatest expressions of the Creator and creation. I see that my dog has just brought me her Frisbee, which means my wife will soon bring me my recharging cord, so we're in good shape. And I want to say that I'm particularly taken by when desert spiritual traditions emerged in the Western world, that it was a time when the Catholic Church, or the Western Catholic Church, was in a hostile takeover by the Roman Empire that really changed the fabric of what Christianity had been in the first 4 centuries. And that, just one moment here, that thousands upon thousands of well-educated Christians who had taken vows of poverty and were working in the urban areas of Rome and Athens, Istanbul, Aleppo, and other places on the Eastern Mediterranean coast, gave up their esteemed positions in universities, businesses, or government in the Eastern Mediterranean and sought refuge in the desert, not only in the desert of the Seti, where we have gained the term asceticism, a place to the west of Cairo and Alexandria, where I visited 3 or 4 times, but also in the Negev, in the deserts of eastern Turkey, around Cappadocia, Ephesus on the coast of Turkey, and other parts of the Mediterranean basin and Arabian Peninsula. And as I hinted earlier, some of these desert traditions then went eastward all the way to the Gansu corridor in China, where there was this enormous interaction between Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Christian, and Muslim ascetics in the near the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts. So those original desert mothers and fathers were using the metaphors of the desert in front of them to describe their spiritual journeys, their metanoia, their own personal transformations, just like many people this century have used the metamorphosis of the monarch butterfly to describe their own metanoic journey that's transformed them. And I think they were leaving behind the decadence of the Roman and Greek empires for something that they thought was much more in line with the poverty expressed not only by Jesus of Nazareth, but many of the prophets in the later scriptures of what we call the Old Testament. There was prophecies that Ellen Davis and Heschel and other people have talked about that were leading in the same direction that Jesus and the first desert fathers and mothers were long before the 4th century AD. And so let me talk about some of those. One is admitting that most of us at some point in our lives or another go through a deep spiritual thirst or drought. That even if we're avidly and almost obsessively interested in spiritual practice, we hit dry spots. And by facing those dry moments head on, as Mother Teresa did, where she admitted to her followers that for over a decade, she had been in a period of spiritual thirst. By acknowledging that and facing that head on, that we enter a point of unknown. We enter the shadow space and the darkness around us. We enter the poverty of the desert, is in no way saying that we failed as spiritual seekers, but that we're truly on a journey beyond the trivial and tokenist expressions of it. So any of you that feels like now and then you bottom out in your studies or need a break from it because you're vexed by deeper questions and you can handle at the moment, don't think of yourselves as failing at that moment, but give yourself some credit for being on the right track. It's hard work. And that Thomas Merton, was prone to saying, I became a contemplative thinking I was seeking an enlightenment, but I've spent most of my adult life now in some kind of darkness of unknowing that's making me question my very being in an existential way. Means that every part of spiritual growth is certainly not, overwhelmed by happy faces, that we have to go through pain and deep questioning to get somewhere. And so for many people, the desert is a landscape of inherent discomfort. The heat and the solar radiation stress and the dryness and the thorniness and spininess of the plants around you and the paucity of what looks to be edible resources can be frightening to any of us that have gone out for solos in the desert and come back to talk about them later on. And I think we should not at all confound any of those or conflate them with self-torture or self-denial or self-defacement or injury. To the contrary, those existential trials, whether we do them in deserts or not, are bound to be challenging to us, and being in austere landscapes heightens that experience in a powerful manner. And again, I know sisters and monks in monasteries on the coast of Ireland and Scotland that call their own monastic landscapes deserts. And I simply think that we find those deserts anywhere in our lives that we need to. It may be an urban dystopian wasteland like the one I grew up with in Gary, Indiana, that by the time I dropped out of high school, 2/3 of the population of the city I lived in felt that the city had been a failure and was going to fall apart and blow away. And to some extent, they've been true about that. There's incredible efforts at regenerating that city that I applaud. But what I'm saying is that we can find the challenges of the desert in both urban and rural settings, not just wilderness settings. So what I would say is that the experiments of collective living, as well as eremitical living that happened around the oases in the desert of the Seti, left us with a lasting literature that not only Thomas Merton, but dozens of scholars like my dear friend Douglas Christie have drawn upon and written about and used to guide their own spiritual journeys over the last 50 years. And there's really been a strong revival of interest of those, perhaps even an exponential growth of scholarly and critical attention to the sayings of the desert and fathers and mothers that have been likened in many ways to Zen koans, although Merton and I think Doug Christie would say there's significant differences in some of the structures of the koans and the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers, but their terseness, their using themselves as fingers to point the way into the unknown, I think are very powerful minimalist ways of focusing our practice on the spiritual and getting free of the things that are cluttering our lives, crowding out our vision, and overwhelming our ears with noise. And so I think there's real power to any of us at whatever point of life we're in, stage of life we're in, into spending time with those spiritual readings and their equivalents in Buddhist, Taoist, Zoroastrian, Sufi, and Judaic traditions. And like many of you, I have a particular affection for the echoes of that tradition in the poetry of Rumi and his fellow Sufi poets. There's probably a dozen now of the Sufis, spiritual poets that are in print. And of course, Rumi by now is the most popular poet in the world in terms of having his work translated into the greatest number of languages and the greatest number of editions of and sales of books by Rumi. He didn't get any royalties for those works, by the way, but a whole cottage industry has developed translating his work, and some of the new translations by people who grew up speaking Farsi as Rumi did are what we call the Persian language, are just so astounding that they're now the focus of performance art throughout the Middle East and Europe and the United States. So I think we're in the midst of a revival of all these desert spiritual metaphors, and I find that really exciting. Let me just link that back to some environmental issues. I call the place we're now living in planet desert, where 30 years ago, I loved to use planet ocean as a metaphor for our lonely planet. But nearly 3/5 of the Earth's surface is now arid or semi-arid. There's over 140 rivers around the world that no longer run to the ocean because their water supplies have been used up for agriculture, industry, or burgeoning cities. And the vegetation of the planet is being more and more desiccated, which makes life more difficult for big, hairy wildlife like lions and tigers and bears, but also for the little guys like monarch butterflies and bats and pollinating insects. And so we have the irony now that the term desert has been used in a disparaging way for more than 2,000 years as an abandoned or desolate place, with implications that it's become a wasteland or failure for human habitation. And yet we're now in a growth industry of making more and more of the desert align with what ecologists consider to be arid conditions. And we can either consider all those places to be failed attempts at habitation in the past, like I suggested people had done with Gary, Indiana, even though there's a tremendous grassroots movement to re-inhabit it. And we can say that we can just write off the number of people that will be living in desert regions for the future because they'll be without water and they'll be hitting temperatures of 130 degrees like my neighbors in Phoenix, Arizona have this last year. Or we can come to terms and face all the dimensions of living in a desert. And much of my writing now is to make us feel comfortable with what deserts are rather than feeling fear or disdainment or disappointment with deserts. What is the landscape telling us? If nature is the original scripture, nature is the original place of incarnation of the creator in the creation, and desert is a good portion of that original nature. How do we come to terms with it? How do we learn from it? And how do we learn from what Thomas Merton called the wisdom of the desert? And we don't learn from it if we block it out, dismiss it, or try to create an air-conditioned shopping mall in its midst. So there's real ecological and spiritual messages to learn from doing pilgrimages, retreats, and other spiritual gatherings in desert regions. And I regularly do so. I'll be in a 4-day spiritual retreat in the Mojave Desert with Loyola Marymount contemplatives in another month, and regularly meet with two spiritual directors from the Desert Foundation, which are Carmelite nuns and priests that formed their own nonprofit to talk about interfaith dialogue about what deserts are. So again, I see that more than I could have imagined in 1970, when as a 17-year-old dropout, I worked at the first Earth Day and slept as an indigent in parks in Washington, D.C. while I worked at the first Earth Day on DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C., that the status of our need to deal with what deserts are and what they may be in our lives is becoming paramount to the whole environmental movement and, if you will, the caring for creation movement. So as an ecologist and conservation biologist, I really see that the non-dualistic thinking that people like Richard Rohr and Thomas Merton have guided us towards is really important in thinking through the ecological lessons that we can learn from spending time in nature. And another group that I feel is doing wonderful work along these lines is the Church of the Wild collective of about, I think it's up to 80 or 90 different interfaith gatherings around the US, Canada, Mexico, and a couple countries elsewhere that have all of their gatherings, congregations, and services outdoors using nature-based metaphors in their liturgies. So again, I just feel really lucky to be alive when all this really creative, innovative activity is helping us rethink some of our desert traditions and our spiritual traditions overall, and bringing them front and center in a way I couldn't have imagined when I grew up in sand dunes 50 years ago as a little kid of Lebanese immigrants. At that time, all I knew is that some of my grandparents used to ride camels and that I would never be able to ride camels. Now I see that the whole access to a world of desert imagery is right before me. Charlie, in terms of the other themes that we want to tie together, are there any that you think I should dwell on at this point?
Sure. I know you asked me to jump in and make sure you didn't go down a rabbit hole too long, but I thought that was linear and beautiful, so I was just in for the ride there. But yeah, I
No
mean,
one's ever accused me of being linear before, Charlie.
one of the strengths of being a transdisciplinary scholar, though, I think anyway. Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear a little bit how some of these challenges in the desert. I mean, you spoke to it from the perspective of working with metaphor, but how is that interfaced with this oscillation between the ecological work you've been doing? And then, I mean, we've talked quite a bit about the spiritual, um, but maybe a bit more about like the ecological work. Um, would that be okay?
Yeah, I'd love to do that now. You know, you, I, I have to say, I hope that you will wise up to some of your own talents and preferred activities earlier than I did, because when I was younger, I just jumped into the dance with anyone who ever wanted to dance with me, whether they were ecologists or conservation activists or social justice activists. And it only recently, say perhaps within the last 3 years, dawned on me that there's no one in the conservation movements or environmental conservation movements that are really championing sacred plants that are right now in this world being endangered not only by climate change and kind of warfare that we see devastating the Middle East right now, but also by cultural appropriation and destruction of habitats by people that may not even see the sacredness in the plants that they're overexploiting or diminishing. And I sort of felt that my right brain and left brain weren't really connected. And here I had all these skills as a botanist and a restoration ecologist, replanting wounded places, and using the metaphor of restoration to bring people together from different cultures to heal the wounds between them, not just the wounds in the land. But that I hadn't gone the other step to say, and by the way, are there any sacred plants in this landscape that used to grow here that have been diminished or driven into extinction that we can bring back? And on visits, including a sabbatical to Lebanon several years back, I spent time with people restoring the sacred cedars of Lebanon that now occur in only about 12 tiny pockets, most of which are smaller than the average college campus in the United States. And they were once the dominant tree on hundreds of thousands of acres in Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And because of boat building beginning in the prehistoric era that involved Assyrian and Babylonian and Egyptian extraction of cedars from Lebanon, one of the first protected areas in the world was a refuge for the cedars of Lebanon, where the Lebanese just said, we're not giving up our remaining trees to build boats for empires. And it occurred earlier, if not as early as Mount Sinai becoming a sanctuary that was off limits to warfare and extraction at Jabal Musa, or what we call Mount Sinai on the Sinai Peninsula today, where, again, everyone would agree that there are plants there that are considered sacred because their knowledge of them was echoed throughout the poetry of the Hebrew scriptures. So about 2 years ago, I began to take this seriously, that I was helping 7 trans-border indigenous tribes along the US-Mexico border fight the construction of Trump's wall that was damaging sacred springs, where for centuries they were collecting native plants for sacred and spiritual uses. And at the same time, I was spending time in villages where my ancestors had dwelled on the Lebanon-Syrian border, helping with restoration projects there. And I realized, whoa, wait a minute, maybe this is a global phenomenon. How many organizations are actually dedicated to the conservation, restoration, and what should I say, culturally appropriate access to sacred and ceremonial plants? If 1/3 of all plants in the world are now threatened or endangered, how many of those are sacred, whether it's in Asia, Africa, Southern Europe, Latin America, or here in North America? So last year on Earth Day, I I'd received an honor from the Arab world through the Takrim Foundation, and I was with 500 innovators and thought leaders from the Arab world in Boston, and I announced a new initiative called the Sacred Plant Biocultural Recovery Initiative. And it's really, to use that metaphor, that sacred plants are probably the canary in the coal mine to tell us of darker things that may be on the horizon. If the plants that for millennia our cultures have protected and conferred a sacred status to, and if they're endangered, what the heck is happening to the rest of the flora and fauna? And so in 3 weeks after I can fully recover from this spine surgery that I had last week and begin to travel again, we're having the first retreat of this Sacred Plant Biocultural Recovery Initiative with people from 9 indigenous nations in North America, and Park Service and nonprofit conservation organizations, to figure out some common ground on how these may be better protected and restored and even returned to some places. And just 2 quick digressions about that. There's actually a subdiscipline of ecology that, when I tell theologians of this, they're sort of floored. It's called resurrection ecology. And what these paleoecologists do is they drill down into the muds and peat bogs of springs that have dried up. And using augers, they bring back to the surface seeds that might have been buried 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, and try to germinate those and reconstruct the flora of what appeared in that landscape thousands or hundreds of years ago, and then use some of those seeds, if they can germinate them, to help in the restoration of that landscape once you add water back to it, or bring the equivalent of those plants in from other landscapes. So they're actually going to places that look dead, searching for seeds of plants that were thought to be dead or extinct, and bringing them back to life. Now, they could probably use some words other than resurrection to get a large part of the American populace excited about that work. But I just think it's incredibly ironic that now we can use those same techniques to help with sacred plants that have in some way suffered their own crucifixion. The other thing I'd like to say is that there's so many commonalities between the work that my wife and I have been doing with friends here on the US border, and the work that I was doing on the Syria, Lebanon, Israeli border before this war started. This horrible war that no one will win anything from. And that's that some of the sacred groves and remnant patches of plants, like wild pistachio in the Middle East, are single trees or patches of trees that are called reconciliation trees, where Druze, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian members of the same community used to meet at to offer apologies to one another and to do peace and reconciliation. And for that reason, even though much of the destruction that we're seeing right now in Lebanon, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and West Bank are from missiles and bulldozers, oftentimes forces on foot know to pardon those plants, to to exempt them from any damage. There's a great story during the 2004, 2006 war between Israel and Egypt and Syria that generals agreed by walkie-talkie to leave a battlefield that had just broken into bloom with desert wildflowers in the Negev, and to have their troops retreat so that that would not be damaged. Now, there's irony to that. We're still damaging humans in other ways, but we're making concessions to the natural world that all of us feel an obligation to knowledge and honor as sacred. So there's a certain irony in putting sacred plants before the suffering of human beings. And yet I don't think it's an either or situation. I think it's another dualistic false choice. That if we use those plants and the replanting of them, even along borders, to get people in the trenches, to create demilitarized zones that can last, because we see those landscapes of value to all of humankind. We may have a chance of breaking the vicious cycle of karmic tragedy that we're seeing in the Middle East today, where it seems like every 50 years we have another series of horrific traumatic events that put a whole new generation, whether it's Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, into traumatic stress for another full generation or two. And so we're still living with the post-traumatic stress of World War II, and we're creating another wave of that. It just seems like we're not learning from our own history of what we need to avoid at all costs. And so in ways, I take the capacity to bring together people who've seen themselves as adversaries to build a better future together, and to not look at each other through an ideological or racist, sexist, or classist lens, but to be in the ditches with one another, getting our hands dirty and getting inoculated by the microbes in the soil there, that can do far more than talk about peacemaking. That when you're down in the trenches with someone, it doesn't matter whether the person next to you is a lesbian, gay, agnostic, bisexual, or any other orientation, belief, or persuasion, that you're working together for something that transcends ideologies and isms. And I think right now, more than any other thing in the world, we should let the isms go extinct and try to save everything else. So I just want to bring that up, that I went from thinking that ecological restoration is something I've been involved in since I worked at multiracial summer camps for inner city youth in the Chicago area in the 1970s. I used to think that it was all about the trees and it, getting the trees in the ground, making sure that everyone learned how to plant trees, even if they never planted one before. And now I believe it's all about joining hands, and that the trees are the metaphor that bring us together, but it's our own hands joining for common work and common values. that is the ultimate achievement of any work like that.
Well, Gary, with that, would you like me to open it up? And I certainly have some questions, or I didn't want to catch you there in a thoughtful pause, but just want to check in.
I'd love to hear some voices other than my own.
Sure. Well, with that, I'll say, everyone, I think we have a small enough group here too. The chat should be open. Um, Feel free to either raise your hand and I can call on you to unmute yourself, or drop a question in the chat and I'm happy to read it as well. Um, I'll give you all maybe a minute to, if you have some questions, to compose yourself and drop something in the chat. So maybe I'll lead off with one question if that's okay. Um, there's a lot there. I have a lot of questions, Gary. I think, yeah, you just, some of those points there at the end too, really, yeah, I'm trying not to get distracted by the power of those closing comments. I want to jump back maybe to the beginning of your talk, um, where you made a comment about desert spirituality not necessarily needing to happen in a desert. Or something, of the like. It was through this thread of metaphor. Um, I guess, can you speak to maybe what there were certainly some pros, we spoke to, but maybe what some of the consequences are of when you remove a spiritual tradition out of the place that it evolves, or originates. And, I think we've been speaking obviously here a bit about like Jewish and Christian traditions. So what comes to mind, of course, is Judaism, that through its exile out of the land, it is forced to codify its oral tradition. And there's all of these consequences when you take a people and their tradition out of the land that is the sort of central hub. Um, so can you just talk maybe a little bit more about what desert spirituality can look like in environments that are not deserts?
Yeah, I love that question, and I'm going to start with a wider hoop than that, Charlie, because my wife and I work with indigenous cultural communities that have lived in the same places for thousands of years, and their spirituality is so finely honed to those places. It's a place-based spirituality, as Findeloria talked about, and in contrast to what Ibrahim Heschel conceded was one of the weaknesses of Judaism and Christianity, is that it had become placeless by becoming globalized. It lacked connection to particular places and the rituals there. And so that even things like the bitter herbs that were originally the Jews' mallow that grew on the Nile, in a very specific place, had to be replaced by things like horseradish, because no one in Europe or America could find the original bitter herb that was so sacramental to ancient Hebrews. So we lose something when our spirituality is detached from space, and that's why I'm part of the Church of the Wild movement, because it brings those metaphors of particular places back into currency in a strong way, rather than having them be an occasional or token sideshow. But I also think you're saying some really, really interesting questions about how we all practice what we do. I mean, I think after deep reading in Buddhism and listening to very gifted teachers, I found that after, from say age 18 or 17 to age 24, 25, just immersed in that, I found I couldn't be a good Buddhist because the metaphors and the rituals that are just so familiar to people of Jewish descent had absolutely no point of reference in my mind or heart, that it would take me another 15 to 20 years to gain that deeper appreciation of them. So I was borrowing someone else's metaphors rather than using, and sacraments rather than using what was right at my very feet. And so that's why I left Buddhist practice. And we know that this is an imperfect world, that many of us are, if not emigrants, our families are refugees that had to escape terrors. That's what happened to my family a century ago. That's how they became Lutherans and Catholics in the U.S. rather than Maronites and Roman Orthodox and doing their prayers in Aramaic and Syriac in Lebanon. And so we know we live in an imperfect world. And now I think it's the chore of each of us to find a balance between what's in our own ancestral spiritual traditions that still make sense to us and what's right outside our back door. And to take both of those seriously rather than privileging one over the other. And each of you are going to do that in a different way, and the balance is going to be differently. If you're from a deeply Jewish household and all of that richness is in the currency of your daily language, keep it, you know. And if you've just moved to a desert and it makes absolutely no sense to you, but you used to live at 14,000 feet in the Rockies and you know what the alpine trend is like and how gorgeously spiritual it can be, use what's there. You know, it's like the old rock song from the 60s, love the one you live, love the sacred place you're with. You know, find sacredness where you can, but I bet it'll be closer to you than you can ever imagine.
Beautifully put. Well, I'm glad to see we have some hands up. I saw two come up at the same time. So maybe Carol, I'll start with you. Feel free to ask your question.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Charlie, because I have to leave in a couple minutes. Do you prefer to be called Gary?
You could call me Hey You.
All right, Gary, Brother Coyote. Thank you so much for this. This was lovely. No, not all of us are young students. I really appreciate how you fed us in terms of I'm gonna call it the desert of dissertating for sure, of working on a PhD as well. And that was really lovely. And thank you for talking about the deserts in our lives in a positive way, and especially thank you for your positivity. If desert spirituality, it creates the kind of positivity I hear you expressing, I'm in awe of it. So thank you for that. It helped me recast Dorothy Day's autobiography was The Long Loneliness. I was like, well, I wanted that title. It helped me recast the loneliness of my life as the spiritual desert I have needed for my spiritual path. So thank you very much. I'm in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, so not technically ESR, but may I please share 3 sentences with you that I just put in my dissertation that I think make this beautiful connection that I'd love to hear your response to, because I'm bringing through a philosophy from the perspective of a mother and grandmother. May I just
Wow,
share?
I'd love that.
Okay, if I may beg everyone's patience for 3 sentences here. Thank you. I'd love to hear your feedback. So this is talking about the experience of having a baby within oneself, and then the baby coming out of oneself as a mother being pregnant and giving birth. When one carries the sacred within oneself, if anything is sacred, surely a child is sacred, and then one births the sacred into the physical world, the sacramental experience evokes an integral monism in which one recognizes the reality of sacredness within physical being. In an integral monism, the inner and the outer experience intertwined becoming, such that all embodied being reveals itself as sacred.
Oh, I love that. I just think you're spot on. I mean, that's that non-dualistic thinking, but it's also, about the journey to find the sacredness within and surrounding us, and that at some level we're all in the amniotic fluid still, and in another way we're all giving part of our lives and suffering through something, hopefully on behalf of others. and that I think you've really expressed a palpable way of thinking about what's embedded in that slippery term metanoia. I think you just pinned it. That's just so beautiful.
Well, thank you. I just want to offer that feminine archetypal experience of birthing as part of what I believe is important for honoring the earth. I mean, all living beings are birthed on the earth, right? So thank you for letting me
Well,
share.
I really welcome that feminine perspective that's reinvigorating our spirituality in so many ways. And I had to laugh the other day when Tim Walz, our vice presidential candidate, said, sometimes I can be a knucklehead. And I think guys like me feel like we grew up mostly being knuckleheads, and that sometimes we really had to listen to women around us who were more tangibly in touch with the sacred than we were, to get back on track. And so I'm not saying that all men are knuckleheads and there's never been a woman knucklehead. I'm saying that we have to be reminded sometimes by someone of another gender of these nuances and swings between inner and outer worlds, because we each draw upon different kinds of metaphors for expressing those.
Yes, just to point out, I'm extremely grateful for the 2 men on my dissertation committee. Very grateful for them.
That's good.
Sarah, thank you for your patience. I see your hand up as well.
Hi, yes, that was beautiful. I'm really emotional right now. Actually, I had what I wanted to say, and then Carol, you used some words that are going to feed into it, but are channeling a different emotion. But I live on the East Coast. I've been in the Northeast my whole life, and then I was out in the Bay Area at CIIS, and then in the Pacific Northwest. And I am such a earth and water kind of person, but I felt so drawn to the desert, and I moved to the Sandia Mountains of New Mexico, and was living there for a few years, and it was very life-changing for me. And there was so much about it that wasn't just about how much abandonment that I felt and how isolated I was. I was literally living on a mountain in the middle of nowhere by myself in the most beautiful piece of land I had ever lived, under the stars, and with these creatures I wasn't used to being around, and I was alone. And I really felt that energy of abandonment and this void and the emptiness and kind of that shadow and the venom and the death. It was just death and death and death and death and death. It was this like ongoing, nonstop spiritual dying and rebirth. But what I noticed there was this life, and there was this kind of potentiality for life that I maybe just was not appreciative of in other places, because it just seemed so present. anything from like taking a walk and seeing a cactus flower bloom in a color that you would only imagine before would exist somewhere like in Brazil. You know, this fuchsia bright color that's coming out in the desert, or the medicines and the indigenous cultures that I met. But also kind of this opening. There was like this pure potentiality for life. And this is very personal, but I'm open to speaking about it because Carol mentioned this maternal line, this mothering aspect of the desert. And I was actually given life in the desert that I never thought was possible. And that it, you know, this life was taken from me, and then a new life was given to me within my womb. And I unfortunately did not continue with that because I wasn't ready for that. But that's how magical it was, is this time in the desert literally gave me something, literally gave me new life, feminine life through my being that I never thought was possible. And there's just so much there. I mean, that's as spiritual as it gets. That's as watering, you know, of the seeds and of the desert as it gets. So it's just, sorry if that's too personal. But yeah, this talk meant a lot to me, and I'm shaking and crying, but it's just a beautiful thing. And then something else you mentioned too, you know, the ecology of place, and endangerment of species, whether we're speaking, you know, medicinal plants or even animals, because a lot of our antibiotics actually come from venom. They come from snakes and other venomous creatures. So just thinking about that, and maybe an idea I had too of how the sacrifice of those lives as well bring in new life, new magic, and new creatures into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've expressed it perfectly, that there's sort of the yin and yang of death and suffering with the brightness and lightness of being in places like the Sandias or the Mojave Desert or the Black Rock Desert in the Great Basin, where you feel that interplay in a place that's all too green. You know, Wallace Stegner said that as America's demography moved west, we needed to get over the color of green. If you're in a place that's unilaterally green the whole year round, you take it for granted. But fewer and fewer of Americans can take that vivacity for granted anymore because of droughts and floods and hurricanes and wildfires. And so when we're in a place like the Sandias, you feel both ends of that spectrum right in front of you, face to face every day, the dying and the rebirthing.
We have a question that's come in the chat from Kim. Thank you for being here, Kim. What do you recommend of Thomas Merton, where he dives into this idea of wisdom of the desert? And two, you mentioned the Church of the Wild. Can you clarify where this is located, or is there a website? And I think if you wouldn't mind, maybe we'll use this as an opportunity. You talked about the working group at Stanford as well. I'm trying to think if there was anything else, maybe some technical things, active groups you mentioned as resources maybe here for students.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. So that's about 4 things, and you may have to walk
Yeah,
me
sorry,
through.
I just
Yeah. Well, let me start off with
The
Church of
Thomas
the Wild
Merton.
and go backwards. So Church of the Wild is something that was started by 2 young women theologians, Victoria Loers, who wrote a book called Church of the Wild, and Valerie Sorrells, her younger sister, who were fascinated with place-based spirituality and the promise of creative liturgies out in nature, in farmlands, or in city parks along riversides where people did walking meditation in silence for part of their time together, but they also may have an ecstatic liturgy and then go into a couple hours of ecological restoration work, planting trees or sowing grasses or other activities, building erosion control structures, and then they have a feast together. And it's since exploded into 1,000 variations of that. There's a Church of the Wild website. There's a 2-year spiritual leadership program. There's a 5-week leadership renewal program that I just went through. And when I came through it, it was through that in the Center for Action and Contemplation. COVID popped its ugly head up, and we really couldn't have in person sessions as much as we wanted to. So we waited and had desert spirituality retreats with visiting speakers from many parts of the country come in and speak to us. And so we'll probably start that up again, but we don't have a website for that yet. The Church of the Wild website is a good one. Evan Mays, Jewish theologian at Stanford, has this spiritual ecology working group that I think I missed because I was in surgery last week. They had the gathering the same day as my surgery, but they have some remarkable people that are scholars looking at those terms, spiritual ecology and contemplative ecology, from a number of angles, both historical and philosophical and practical, and what the obligations of people who are interested in contemplative ecology have to deal more directly with the real world problems that some might say our institutions were slow in taking up, like they've taken up poverty and racism, where perhaps the Greek Orthodox Church has had the strongest commitment to ecological restoration and spiritual ecology of any group that I do, but they don't own that. They say everyone has to do their part. So those are two of the things you talked about, and there's about 2 more that I can't remember right now. Do you remember any other things I can touch on quickly?
Well, and the Thomas Merton, is it the text Wisdom of the Desert you were referencing, or
the New Directions book that it's been in print forever, the Wisdom of the Desert, is where he first dealt with that, but Seeds of Contemplation and a lot of his later writings do as well. There's a beautiful homage to Merton's death anniversary that Emergence magazine put out a year and a half ago, that is a film narrated by my dear friend Fred Bonson, that you see Merton's last journals in front of you, photos that he took from his camera with rolls that remained undeveloped until someone realized, oh, Tom's camera is still here. Let's see if he had anything on it. And then recordings of him by the great journalist Peter Nabokov in New Mexico when he was at Christ on the Desert Monastery. And they're all woven together to look at Merton's sense of desert spirituality. And it's just about a 10-minute dream journey. You feel like you're sitting in Merton's lap as he's driving a car or something, or a jet plane over the spiritual places. So check that out. And then there's several other nodes of spiritual ecology that I can't pull up right now. One in Kentucky that's called Soul and Soil podcasts that I direct people to.
Wonderful. And I see our chair here, who's tonight with us tonight, Dr. Allison, also put in a link to Stephen Blackmer. Did I say that right? Okay.
That's right.
Who spoke at one of our summits. And then Chantel dropped a link to what you're referencing, the long form piece in Emergence magazine on Thomas Merton.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
And I should say, my Buddhist teacher, Nelson Foster, did a beautiful thing on earth spirituality and activism for Buddhists that that Tassajara may have published. And Norman Weirs at Duke has done 3 or 4 anthologies on spiritual ecology.
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you so much for this really rich talk that wove together so many themes that we study here in ecology, spirituality, and religion. And we haven't really touched on the desert this much. So you brought so much richness with talking about desert spirituality. I think it will continue to resonate in our classes, I'm sure. So as I was really struck by your stats on planet desert, that 3/5 of the land is arid or semi-arid. I was not aware of that, and that is shocking and appalling. And so I'm wondering, in your work with desert spirituality, if you draw any lessons from desert spirituality for living in planet desert as we face hard times. I mean, right now we're in a deluge, right, with 2 hurricanes hitting the US in 2 weeks. But the flip side of that is the really arid times. And I'm wondering if you're drawing those connections.
Yeah, I love that question. And let me also say that because of my fatigue from my surgery last week, I may have to have that as the last question because I'm
Sure.
starting to have more difficulty speaking. But thank you. I have to say that the spiritual should inevitably feed back into the practical, like a Mobius strip. And I'm a professed Franciscan brother in an interfaith Franciscan order, the Ecumenical Order of Franciscans. It's recognized by Anglican and Catholic and Lutheran orders. But we've also had Hasidic Jews and Buddhists and Quakers in that order. And one of the things that emerged out of that was one of our brothers started a Earth Care Youth Corps in the Syracuse area for inner city kids as a summer program, reforesting and cleaning up blighted urban areas. So the kids were doing spiritual readings together and reading things like Sand County Almanac and The Man Who Planted Trees together, but working across ethnic, racial, and gender and class lines. And we adopted that, and my wife and I set up the first program like that in Arizona that's now called Borderlands Earth Care Youth Corps. And about 180 kids from, it's over 200 kids now have done that at 3 locations along the border. Some kids coming from south of the border to participate, and they get paid $15 an hour, 6 hours a week, but have to do 1 hour of volunteer work in restoration practices in their own neighborhood and another hour of journaling after reading some of the references I just mentioned. And so I think there's ways that spiritual organizations can convene the practical work. I've also been involved in farm and food camps and farm collectives where people in a religious or theological studies program like you all decide to have an intentional community where they grow their own food and make that food sacramental. And there's some wonderful books written out of that movement too, that I think means that there's ways that all these issues can touch our daily lives, not be just something we read about or that we seek out on the Sabbath. And so there's far more than I can point you to in just 1 hour, but I'm so grateful for all of you, and you're welcome to stay in touch through Charlie. And if there's pressing questions that you have as a follow-up, I'd be happy to correspond with you through Charlie, okay? So blessings to you all, and my fatigue and my little Australian Shepherd puppy, my wife are calling me, so I'm going to bow out now. Thanks again.
Thanks
Okay,
so
well,
much.
thank you, Dr. Nabhan. Thank you.
Take care.
Um,
Bye-bye.
You
Thank
too. Well, and thank you all so much for being here this evening. Just a quick parting word. I encourage you, Dr. Nabhan, he's such a fascinating human being and scholar with a wide variety of work, but also a voice. I was just going through some books today. He's an edited volume, The Nature of Desert Nature, to a book where he falls in love with a mesquite tree and kind of talks about it. It's a mesquite and arboreal love affair. My point is he has such a range, and he's really a character. And hopefully, as demonstrated by this talk tonight, he's done an incredible amount of work. I mean, I really feel grateful to have had him come and speak this evening. So yeah, thank you all so much. And particularly, I know, right, he just had a back surgery, and I know he can't be feeling well. So um, anyway, wherever you all are in the country, in the world, thanks for being here. I hope you have a wonderful evening, night, and can think about desert spirituality. All righty, everyone, take care.